feel like I should go more in-depth with my discussion of the episode Cover Up, which I listed as number 1 on my top 12 worst Powerpuff Girls episodes list. I've seen comments related to this episode that were similar to mine, but quite honestly, I'm surprised that this episode doesn't get more complaints. Let's start with the fact that this episode actively advocates teasing a child for having insecurities, or more accurately for the coping mechanisms used to deal with said insecurities. This episode shows Buttercup hugging a blanket and murmuring, "I am a good fighter, I am a good fighter." This is portrayed as some sort of crazy or diseased way of thinking or acting. But people do use affirmations in the real world, and they've been shown to work, so this portrayal is inaccurate. Then the episode shows Blossom and Bubbles teasing Buttercup about the blanket. You know, I thought Blossom said, and I quote, "We have an intrinsic duty to uphold peace, not only among the citizens of Townsville, but amongst ourselves." Those words don't hold much weight if you don't follow through with them. But I forgot, that only applies when Bubbles is the victim, right? You know how Mr. Enter feels about DW? I sometimes feel that way about Bubbles, though to a much lesser degree. Though I do feel that each of the girls is a good character for the most part, Bubbles is constantly held up as one who can do no wrong. And even if she is in the wrong, it's played off as some innocent little mistake with little to no consequences on anyone around her. This is a serious problem, because it creates a double, or in this case triple, standard for judging each of the girls' behavior. Also, Bubbles teases Buttercup for having a blanket when she's constantly playing with Octi, a stuffed octopus. You'd think she'd show a little sympathy for this reason, but no, she laughs right in Buttercup's face. I guess that's one reason to call her the joy and the laughter. Another thing I noticed is that Blossom's strategy of tricking Buttercup just felt forced. She said that she replaced Buttercup's blanket with just a random blanket lying around the house. But why would there just be a random green blanket at the house? I mean, Buttercup is really the only one living there who likes the color green, so who else would it belong to? Also, I didn't really think it was Blossom's place to deceive her like that. Last time I checked, it was the professor, not Blossom, who was the parent around here. I believe that if the girls had just minded their own business and let the professor take care of this, the episode would have been much better. But Professor was hardly in this episode. At all. If he were to show up like he did in Boogie Frights and the main event, to give Buttercup a sort of pep talk like he did for the other girls, this episode would have been much better. You'd think that being her parent, he would have been there for her when she needed him to be. I really think that this sort of talk would have helped her greatly. But no, he only shows up at the very end to lighten the mood after the girls force Buttercup to give him her blanket. By the way, why is it funny when Professor and the narrator do the affirmations, but weird and creepy when Buttercup does it? Unless they're both making fun of her, then that makes it even worse. The girls essentially forcing Buttercup to give up her blanket could have serious implications for children watching the show, or even for adults that happen to be watching the show. I mean, think about it. Buttercup had her blanket taken from her. That's like someone taking your favorite teddy bear or doll. And while this might not be particularly bad for an adult, or maybe it might be depending on who you are, I don't know, I think it could be particularly traumatizing for children. But here's what really makes me angry. The way that this episode is structured tells me that I should agree with Blossom and Bubbles and find their teasing justified. It portrays Buttercup loudly crying to where she looks crazy and irrational, hoping that I will get tired enough of her loud crying to side with the girls. That is perhaps the most abhorrent way I have ever seen to manipulate someone into agreeing with you. Not to mention it's an insult to my intelligence. I hate that Buttercup is portrayed as a crazy little girl having a temper tantrum, when she's really just a scared little girl who wants her blanket to make her feel better. And to make matters worse, little kids really do get attached to things like blankets in real life. So what does this episode say about them? It says that we should see them in the exact same way as we see Buttercup. Way to insult the audience with that kind of blanket statement. No pun intended. In other words, the writers expect us to agree with an episode that insults half of its target audience, while at the same time rooting for the characters that degrade said audience. Also, just as a side note, Bubbles cries all the time, and sometimes over the littlest things, and I'm usually expected to feel sorry for her. But when Buttercup cries this one time, this episode wants me to find it annoying and terrible, which I don't. This episode should really be focusing on Blossom and Bubbles' cruelty toward Buttercup. I mean, both Bubbles and Blossom experience teasing and laughing in Bubble Vision and the main event, respectively. But at least those episodes show that the teasing was a bad thing. I strongly believe that this episode could have been great if it were done in the same basic style. It may have been a bit formulaic, but at least it would have had heart. But no, this episode decided to portray the teasing as a good thing that saves the day. I mean, the narrator says the day is saved thanks to the Powerpuff Girls, so what am I supposed to think? And last time I checked, it was Buttercup, and only Buttercup, who defeated the monster, thanks to the confidence she got from having her blanket around. When she didn't have it, she was lacking in confidence and got brutally beaten up by the monster. So, when she goes back to fight another monster after having her blanket taken away, what do you think's going to happen? Do you think she's just going to magically be able to fight without it after having it snatched away? No. Either she's going to resent her sisters for taking away the thing that made her feel better, or she's going to doubt herself again and get beaten up by monsters even worse. As if the beating she got in Moral Decay weren't bad enough already. I mean, she would learn to deal with it eventually, but a kid her age really shouldn't have to. And I really hate it when people say things like, oh, Buttercup deserved it for how she teased Bubbles before. No, she didn't. In fact, this is more malicious than any teasing Buttercup ever did. At least Buttercup apologized or made it up in some way. And to be fair, Bubbles was never forced to give up Octi. Geez, can you imagine how the fans would react if that did happen? There'd be protests and rioting outside the writers' houses. But I guess it's okay when it happens to Buttercup, right? Now, originally, I put this episode ahead of Moral Decay solely because Buttercup did nothing to deserve her torment. Now, in hindsight, I'm so glad I decided to stick with this ordering, but for another reason entirely. You see, both episodes treated us to watching Buttercup's torment, but at least with Moral Decay, all we had to do was watch. With Cover Up, the episode wants us to join in with Blossom and Bubbles teasing Buttercup and wanting her to give up her blanket. That makes the episode even worse in my eyes.